To say South Africa's schooling system is in crisis is probably an understatement. As many as 750,000 children may have dropped out of school over the past 18 months. School attendance is at the lowest level it has been in 20 years. The Basic Education Department is in and out of the courts to explain why it is not providing hungry pupils with their meals. Tonight on the program, we hear from several organizations that are on the ground, not only to get an understanding of the depth of the problem, but also to talk about what needs to be done. But a little later on, we will speak to the leader of the official opposition, John Steenhuisen, about a letter he wrote today to President Cyril Ramaphosa requesting an urgent meeting between the head of state and all opposition leaders. The Watchdog starts now. Let's get to that discussion now. What is going on in our education system? I'm joined for this discussion by the General Secretary of the South African Democratic Teachers Union. I'm also joined by Atenkosi Sopichi from Equal Education. A couple of other guests will also be joining us in a short while. Good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this conversation. I am going to start with the issue of the dropout rate. Mr. Mokoena Maluleke, as many as 750 children may have dropped out of school over the past 18 months. That is a big problem.
Good evening, and good evening to your viewers at home and to the panel that are there. Look, in terms of the report, that from 230,000 as the norm for a dropout, it can go up to 750,000. Look, as a practicing teacher and as a person who's on the ground, I know that even if that number is extrapolated, it's a number that has been over-exaggerated because you have got to factor in the issues like those parents who have applied for homeschooling, which in most schools that was what was happening. But you also have got to look at the temporary, withdrawal of the learners in the first part of July, because parents at the time were still really worried about this particular pandemic, not understanding what is going to happen. However, as we moved into August and September, the teachers and the principals have been able to address the parents, and we're beginning to see the learners coming back. So yes, I cannot discount the fact that we may have almost like 270,000 to 300,000 of learners having dropped out, but 750,000 is something that is over-exaggerating. Even if that, because I think when I read the report is not saying that is exact. They are just merely saying because of the pandemic, if they extrapolate the numbers, it can give them almost double what has been happening, or 3 times what was happening. So yes, I'm not that concerned that much to that number. We're concerned about a small increase of the dropout, and then obviously some of the dropout does not have to do with exactly because the learners were affected directly by the pandemic at the school, but obviously socio-economic background. Private schools themselves have written letters to parents and say, if you cannot pay, please don't bring your child back to school. And most of the parents who have lost their job or have taken salary cuts or have lost the income clearly would not depend on the tax from UIF that could have been able to afford them transport and afford them to be able to pay the school fees. That's the consequences of an education system that basically promote the defunding of public school, and then low funding for the public school in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of other issues, and promoting private education education, because clearly we know that the private education is about the balance sheet. If you don't pay, your child must be taken out. And if imagine the child has been taken out of the school in September, you're not going to likely get the space in the public schools per se. You'll have got to wait until the next year and so forth. However, our principals are very sensitive that when learners have not got the space in the private school, or they have been expelled from the private schools, they have been admitted. We remember the MEC of Gauteng pleading with the private schools not to expel the children or the learners that parents have really been affected by the pandemic. So clearly, I am saying that the 750,000, it is not an actual number. It is just that they have been estimating to that number can arrive there.
But then, Mukwena, this national income dynamic study has been fairly accurate. Why would you doubt it this time?
Well, this time around, because clearly it is that whilst they have used the household income as part of their research, I'm saying that I talk to the principal, I visit the schools, and the principal have been able to tell me straight that, look, we know that so and so was not coming to school. We have then spoken to the parents have brought the child back. So I'm saying, yes, there is a concern about the dropout, but it cannot. It's impossible to go to 750,000 of learners really to dropping out. It's not going to happen. It's not happening now. Maybe into the future it can happen. So yeah, I contest that.
Okay, Athenkosi, your take on this dropout rate report?
I think there's always been issues with the department and the data that's provided. So it's a bit difficult to verify to the T whether these numbers are true or not. But I think it's something that for us, we need to acknowledge that there's been huge numbers of learners who have dropped out, primarily because some of the learners have abilities and they were scared to return back to school. And also some of them scared of infecting their own parents. There's a myriad of issues that have forced learners out, and especially and most critically, there's been a huge chunk of learning time that's been lost. And so a lot of the learners have sort of come back to us and said, is it really worthwhile for me to go back to school knowing that I will do well? If you were to review last year's numbers in terms of how learners did, it will clearly show that the COVID pandemic and lockdown have affected how learners have performed. And part of those things is that the learning time lost really impacted the poorest of the poor communities. And that's something to be extremely concerned about. Primarily looking to the government and the Department of Basic Education to see what is their plan to actually get those back into the system so that they can continue learning again, and what means they can make to make sure that their families are able to mitigate the results or consequences of COVID-19 and the lockdown, especially around job loss and parents not having the capacity to get children back to school.
Okay, I'm going to ask our guys to try and redial you, Athenkosi. You've been dropping here and there. I hope we'll be able to redial you and get you back on a much cleaner line. But Matakanye, your take on this 750,000 children may have dropped out issue?
Thank you very much, Vuyo, and all your listeners, Vuyo, and our condolences, Vuyo, to the teachers who passed on during the holidays due to this pandemic. Also, the parents and the parents and the children who passed on during the unrest. We are saying do. And coming to this 700, I do not want to agree more with the General Secretary of SADU, Ntate Maluleka, that I believe the 700 is exaggeration. It would not have gone to that level. Although I would like to thank very much the labor movement, Bontate Maluleke, le Bontate Base, the battle that we have fought since the outbreak of this pandemic last year. If you remember, Vuyo, that some of the academics were saying schools must close and reopen this year. I think it is now the unions, the associations, and other related, and the Department of Basic that fought and say, we don't know when will this pandemic come to an end. Let's fight on and let's learn to live with this pandemic. And it is true that some of our children who wrote matric, they are in universities, and we are still battling on to say our children must go on, must come back to the school. You know that on the 2nd, then the grade R, the grade 7 will be coming back. But the battle is really on that some people do not really want these children to go. And it is true that parents listen to those people who say, if these children go back to school, they are going to die. If these children are going back to school, then they are going to affect. And those are some of the things that made the children, that made the parents to withdraw their children. And we know that some children's parents could have passed on during this pandemic, and those could be the children that are affected by this, but some could have been affected by those academics. You know them, Vuyo, those academics where we say schools should not open, and some members of the community, the society, who are still fighting right now as I'm talking to you, that children should not go back to school. So, but I don't think really 700 as we have reached 700. It could be, as it has been said, 30, 250, probably around that, you know. Although then I'm happy that parents finally agreed with us that children must go back to school, and they are supporting us on that call, irrespective of these criminals who are breaking down the schools. And at times when the schools are broken down, are vandalized, parents lose really hope in those type of schools. Then they withdraw their children. But they're not that much as it has been said, maybe by the survey.
Let's then say, okay, there's all these conditions on the ground, whether it's the fear factor, whether it's what is happening in certain communities, violence and so on. Let's then go back to the pre-pandemic numbers, Mr. Maluleke. The 230, 250,000, is that acceptable? Is that something we should be having?
No, Vio. It's not what we're saying is acceptable. We are saying it's a serious concern, because you are in South Africa, which economy is not growing, and obviously the grinding poverty in our communities. You cannot say 230,000 is an acceptable number. However, that has always been the number. And you have got to benchmark it with other countries in terms of the dropout and say, is this a universal phenomenon that you would have around 230,000 out of maybe 12 million learners that might be dropping out every year and so forth. And South Africa moved from almost like 279 or 290 in recent years to 230. It used to be more, but as we started introducing the issue of feeding schemes, started introducing the issues of no fee schools, we started seeing the improvement and the retention of the learners in the school. It used to be very high. So we are doing everything we can as the stakeholders in education to ensure retention. And there has been some policies that have been discussed in order to ensure that there's a retention of the learners in the schools, because we believe that education is an enabler and education can make a very big difference. And even even the rural schools where there is grinding poverty, they still believe that if they send their children to school, they believe very much so that they will be able to change their lives, they will be changing the environment under which they live in, and so forth. So there's still hope and belief in many of our parents in education. And indeed, I know that Matakanyi has touched on the vandalism, he has touched on the criminality that is there, but clearly the lawlessness is the issue that is a problem. So in short, I am saying we cannot rejoice and say that it is an acceptable number to have the pre-pandemic 230,000, but it is within what we can call a universal phenomenon in terms of countries that are low income or middle income countries where dropouts seem to be high as a result of moving of parents from one area to the other in terms of what you can call intra-migration to other province, from one province to the other, from one district to the other. So in between that particular period when the parents are looking for a job, the learner is going to be withdrawn from the school, and therefore that is a dropout. So it is multifaceted problems that we have got to look at that lead to this type of migration. For example, Gauteng every year at the beginning of the year, it is experiencing flood of admission problems as a result of parents having moved around September, others have moved around August and so forth. So clearly, yes, you are going to continue to be having this dropout as parents are looking for a job where the economy of the country is seen to be providing some relief in terms of jobs and so forth. So we need to address the triple challenges in our country in order to address the 230,000 that is not acceptable, because in itself it says that it's perpetuating the inequalities, but obviously it is denying those particular children a human right being education. So I don't think that we can say it's acceptable. However, it is how we are mitigating it, and I think we've done very well to this end, where we're coming from a huge dropout that we used to have.
Then, Atengosi, if we've really done as well as Mugwena says, in reducing the numbers that were once upon a time hovering around 270,000, how come organizations like yours then still have to take the Department of Basic Education and the minister to court, forcing them to provide, food to these hungry children so that they can stay at school?
I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. I think one of the biggest things for us as a movement has been sort of to fight against the lack of transparency and accountability by the Department of Basic Education. It is sort of, usually you found that the Department of Education has been a bit evasive about giving us the true facts about what has happened in our schools and what continues to happen in our schools, which is why Equal Education and some of its partners exist, because basically what you see on paper does not translate to what we see on the ground. And we experience firsthand stories of learners who say that meal that they get at school is the only meal that they'll have for the entire day. Therefore, it is, as a responsible government, it is their duty to make sure that those children are fed, and they keep their promise to those children to make sure that they at least get that one meal a day that they need. If when you're not getting any joy, I've seen, a couple of times you've had to have conversations with the department and make those, court orders. But what have you learned from that experience? Yes, you're saying that they are not forthcoming with but reading between the lines of the little that gets said. What is your gut feel? What is the sense that you're getting about where the problem may actually lie? Because there may well be people out there prepared or willing and able to assist. But if they can't put their finger on the problem and maybe identify areas where they can come on board and assist, then, I think for all the departments, the COVID period has been a huge challenge. But I think knowing the extent of the need should have prompted the department to figure out ways in which they can get food to learners, because these meals are already budgeted for. And so for me, it's a bit unfair to withhold money and resources that are meant to feed learners, and to just simply sit and acknowledge the fact that learners are not getting the meals that they required. I mean, 1.5 million missed meals is a huge number. It's 1.5 million children not receiving a basic meal that they depend on. So that's something that the department should have interrogated and should have on their own come up with alternatives to make sure that they're able to deliver services to children whilst we are in lockdown. Other departments have done it in multiple ways. Even organizations have done it, and we've tried to innovate as far as we possibly can so that we can meet the need of the people. It's difficult to say, and I'm not going to say what my gut feeling is, because for me, that's not an informed way to draw on an opinion. But I do feel
in the absence of real answers from the people who are involved or who should be in the know, what does one do?
I mean, we can throw around accusations, but I think one of the things that we as Equal Education have relied on is learners' voices. And we've spoken to learners, and learners have said that I go to school, and if I'm not due to go to school on that day, I do not get a meal. So those are the stories that we rely on to ensure whether or not the department is doing its job, really. And we go and we live in these communities, and we are part of these communities, and we are able to see what's happening and what's not happening. Because, I mean, if you go through the department's social media and their websites, it seems as if there's a lot of things going on. But I think, we invite the department to have honest conversations about their capacity and what they are able to do and what they're not able to do. And I think it's sad that organizations like Equal Education have to go to the extent of taking the DBE to court every time that they have to do things that they are legally supposed to do, like providing infrastructure, like providing meals for children in South Africa.
From the point of view of school governing bodies, Mataganye, where do you think the problem lies?
Well, thank you very much once again, Fuyo. Fortunately, all of us are South Africans, and we know the history of education in this country. Maybe drawing the experiences as from 1994. Prior 1994, what was really happening in this country? So we look at the Department of Basic Education, and I must not sound like a spokesperson of the Department of Basic Education. However, but we also have to say, prior 1994, what was happening in this country? Was there a meal for these children? Was there free books for these children? Free education for these children and all those, because we have to start building on that and recognize that. But build on that, where the department lacks, then we have to criticize the department. But National Association of School Governing Body is not an opposition party. It's a support structure to ensure that the Department of Education build on what we have already achieved. I think we have really achieved, and we are saying, yes, we have achieved, but do more than that. Like, for instance, now we are saying during this pandemic, because this pandemic has exposed the legacy that the poorer schools, the township schools, deep rural, working class schools, there is really inequalities. And this pandemic has exposed that. But we are saying there are non-negotiables. For instance, we must get running water in those schools. And if there is no running water, in those schools. We should not spare the Department of Basic Education. We must ensure that now there is running water in each and every school, in all 27 schools in South Africa. There must be running water so that all the children, all the teachers are able to wash their hands regularly. And not only that, but also the question of the masks, they must be provided, the question of sanitizers, and screeners must be also appointed in those schools. And this is what we are saying to the Department of Education.
Can I chip in here? Can I chip in here, Mr. Matara? Well, first of all, I don't think successive apartheid governments, can be standard, bearers. They were illegitimate. They didn't care at all about us. And the whole point of removing them was because, one, they were illegitimate, two, because they didn't care, and there were several other reasons we can list as well. So we can't then compare ourselves to them. They were replaced precisely because they were doing all wrong things. But the capacity of a democratic state to be able to serve the needs of its people, yes, will be evaluated by the resources that they have at their disposal. But it's also about, them agreeing to do things, but then not delivering on them. And now, when that happens, questions have to be asked, isn't it?
Yes.
And then take a case like, you saw the matter that was, like today's ruling around PPEs and the disinfection of schools, and in fact it was the disinfection of schools now during COVID. Lots of money paid to people who, as it has turned out, we're charging exorbitant amounts, of money, but doing very little. But what then that does is the money that is supposed to go to those sanitizers are supposed to mobilize an army of people who can actually do the work of sanitizing, the children, sanitizing the schools, doesn't go where it is supposed to go. Now, we've got to raise those issues, not only raise them, but find ways of actually, plugging the holes and doing the right things. And that's what this conversation is really about. And this is not about, yes, you are prefacing your thing by saying you're not their spokesperson, but the way you are coming across is as though you are someone who feels that the basic education department is being attacked unfairly, which you have a right, by the way, to believe, if that indeed is the case. But I'm just saying, just put the facts out there.
No, Vuyo, I agree with you. I really agree with you. And at times, people will hear me in the radios, in the TVs, in the newspapers, attacking the Department of Basic Education. Say you are failing here, because there are things that possibly, as you are saying, the screeners must be there. I think the president must have made money available to hire screeners so that teachers should not do that type of work.
Yes.
Then it must be done by those people. And also, it is true, we should not really spare them when really the sanitizers, the mask, there's this budget that is intended for our children, then it goes somewhere. We can't, really, we cannot massage the Department of Basic Education. We have to be very critical about them. That's why we have said, I think we agreed with Labour that they are non-negotiables. And we are still sticking to that, to say those non-negotiables really are needed in our schools. And we cannot fold our arms when they are not there. And you are right, Vuyo, to say there is this money that is intended for that, but it goes to the different pockets. And we can't. We cannot support the department of that. Then we have to seriously criticize it. We have to seriously redirect the department and say, no, this is wrong.
In fact, In fact, I wasn't even asking you to be critical. Hence, I started, the way I asked the question, I said to you, have you been able to put a finger on it? What is your take? So I'm not asking you to be critical even, but I want us to move to a second issue that Mugwena Maluleke said has been a significant contributor to bringing the numbers or the dropout rate down, and that is the issue of the introduction of no-fee schools. Now, as a member of school, as a school governing body member, is that progressing well now? Or is that still a big factor in the numbers we're talking about? Say we stick to that 230,000 or so that Mugwena Maluleke talked about. Mataganye?
Well, thank you very much, Vuyo. I think we earlier on said it is not 7, it could be 200 and so on. I think you asked a question whether that number is acceptable. And we are saying no. When we talk about...
we've gone past that one. We've gone past that one because I said, okay, let's then talk about the pre-COVID numbers, which is what we're talking about now. So we're confining ourselves to the pre-COVID numbers now. But I'm saying to you that Mugwena mentioned several factors that have been responsible for bringing the numbers to the 230 or so thousand, right? But I'm saying to you that what he mentioned was the contribution of one, the feeding schemes, which we spoke about. And I'm now moving to the no-fee schools. And I'm saying, as a member of a school governing body, what do you believe has been how has the introduction of no-fee schools contributed to bringing down these numbers? Because I don't want us to talk about these issues in broad and general terms. And really the point of this conversation is trying to understand the problems that we are seeing in our education. Not only that, but to begin to put on the table some of the things, or solutions that we think can actually be implemented. So we're talking now about no-fee schools.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mfuyo. The no-fee schools contributed a lot in the sense that now the universal, more or less, we are just there in terms of the universal access of education for our children. And hence, we were trying to compare the past. But let me concentrate on the question of the no-fee. The no-fee contributed a lot in the sense that now the question of school fees was a barrier in this country, in the sense that now we always talk about the poorest of the poor schools. We are talking about the rural, the deep rural, the township, the working class. I mean, we are talking economics around that. When you mention those type of schools, then you are mentioning economics. Then when now you have to pay school fees, then you are unable to pay school fees. It means, therefore, your child will not be able to access education. So the question of the no fee has really contributed so that the poorest of the poor, what they were able to access education now, and it has improved attendance in our school, in schooling so far. The question of the no fee, and we are also happy that now also in terms of the curriculum, then there is a little bit of quality in that when they compare the schools with other schools, with the quintile 4, the quintile 5, they are competing the no-fee schools. So I think firstly is that we are grateful that the poorest of the poor are able to access education, as much as we still have to come and discuss seriously quality education for everybody in the country.
Of course, attendance, Mugwena Maluleke, is one thing. When those children get to school, they need to learn. But as we all know, there have been problems with learning. Let's talk about that, because there's a view that there has been too little learning. That at stages where our children are supposed to know certain things, they don't know. At the stage where they are supposed to have learnt certain things, you realize that a lot of them aren't actually at the stages they are supposed to be. Let's talk about that.
Thanks, Vio. I think that's a very important question indeed. And I think it's taking over from what Ndade Matakanyi was saying, but also Atenkosi was saying. So first and foremost is that, quality education has got to be understood in terms of three things. So for you to have quality education, first and foremost, you need to understand the context under which that education is taking place. Secondly, it has got to do with culture. So you need to understand the culture of that particular community and how they view education and how they use their culture to ensure that they find solution among themselves to ensure that they support education. But thirdly, it is what we do as the people who are there at the level of the school, which is the input. So that will define your quality education, and inputs will also be covering the background of the learner. Okay, so apart from having a teacher in the classroom, you need to also understand the background of that particular learner that you are teaching. So that will begin to define the quality of education. So yes, Ndade Matakanyi says the quality of education is improving in this country, and we must say yes, it is our responsibility, and it is something that we have done as the people of this country to push for universal access to education. But it must not just be a learner in the classroom or learner in that particular four corners, but basically you are just keeping the learner from the street, and therefore there's no quality education that is happening there. I fully want to agree with you. What must happen is that in that particular classroom, there must be that particular quality, but it must then be based on what I have indicated. So if you have highly qualified teachers, highly motivated and supported teachers by the district in terms of both the district having the ability, the capability, as well as the willingness to be able to understand what might be a problem in school A when we don't achieve the required proficiency levels. For example, in reading, that we're not reading with meaning. We need to understand that particular thing. So what was the contribution of the context in that particular area? We're teaching our children in English. And some of us are speaking fifth language English, and we want to be teaching English. And therefore, we don't take those who are supposed to be teaching that English that the children are not speaking at home to be trained and well-trained, and therefore also have the support base that they can be able to support that. So what you are going to see, it is that when learners are being taught in English and they are Tsonga speaking, clearly they are going to lag behind the learner who is speaking English at home and then who is able to understand and benefit from education. I want to give you one example. I don't want to be long. There was a research that was done in the area of Cape Town in a former Model C school. In this former Model C school, without telling the learners who are non-racial, of course, South Africa is a non-racial country. Then the teacher arrived in the morning, and that was research. That then the teacher says, today is akufunda ngeXhosa. Okay? And then what teacher was. Then what happened? The following day, they asked the learners, what were we learning yesterday? How did you find the learning? And then this particular poor little boy stand up and says, I have told my parents that we need to move away from South Africa so that we can go to a country where we can be taught in our own language. Because I am an English speaking, and then here I'm being taught in Xhosa. Okay, that means freedom. Okay, that means freedom. That child understands clearly that he has freedom of choice. He comes from a background that has informed him that you are an English speaker. You cannot be taught in Xhosa, because then they asked this particular kid, but why? He said, I have had nothing. And I don't think I can be able to learn in Xhosa. So my parents, we have got to leave, maybe go to Australia or New Zealand where we can talk. But a Xhosa kid is sitting in front of that particular classroom every day, and it's not being taught in Xhosa. It's being taught in English. And therefore, he has got to understand these concepts. First, they have to think in Xhosa and translate and interpret the learning into English. That is the context under which we must understand the quality of education. So what must we do? Because we can't keep on talking about problems. What must we do? As the union, we have been emphasizing teacher development, that when we have got to improve is that we must teach, that we must train our teachers. We must also come to realize that China was built and is strong today from a country that was excluded from the world because they prioritized their own language of teaching. That a French speaker coming to South Africa as a president is going to want to be having a person who interprets for him to speak whilst he has learned English. But it tells you that this person says, I am a French, not want to change. So this thing of undermining African languages, we are undermining the power and the wealth of knowledge for us to be able to have quality education. So yes, access does not mean quality. It's not meaning that everything when you have access. That's why the law is very clear.
Okay.
Access must not just mean you be there. It must mean something else.
Okay, but we're running out of time. But Atengose, we can't end this conversation without talking about the schools that are closing left, right, and center. An issue I know is very close to your heart. Very quickly.
I think one of the most important things that our late SG, Mr. Gojana, used to say that the parents in the Eastern Cape vote with their feet. We've seen a number of schools being deemed unviable because they have very low numbers of learners, where parents are electing to take their children out. Therefore, if you have 3 learners in a school, then that doesn't qualify as a school. It doesn't make sense to pour resources onto that school. But there's also other factors that lead to parents fighting against the closure of these schools. Is that, for example, they need to then provide transport for the learners when they're being moved to different schools. So while we've mentioned in our previous statements that we support the closure of schools that are not viable, but the reality of it is that we need to ensure that those schools were supported sufficiently before the ECDOE decided for them to close, right? Because you can't be closing schools left, right, and center. You need to interrogate what is the problem? Why is it that learners are moving away from classrooms in the Eastern Cape? And I think that's a fundamental question, that a critical conversation that our department needs to have with parents, because there's a problem. You can't have schools that have traditionally had thousands of learners going to these schools, and then you've seen numbers dwindle. What has been happening? And part of the reports that we've been getting from SGB members and concerned parents is that some of these schools had struggled with teachers, having enough teachers to teach their children. And some of them had to sort of let go of certain grades. So you can't have a school that has grade R to grade 3 and then suddenly grade 7. There needs to be progression, and there needs to be qualified teachers across all these different levels to make sure that learners are able to be taken through their curriculum as they should be. So there's many concerns as eco-education that we have with the process, in that consultation also needs to consider those things and the lived realities of those parents. So yeah.
Okay, Matakanye, quick, we have 30 minutes. A part of the problem, of course, is that these children, 40% of grade 1 learners, exit the system before they get to grade 12, which in part probably explains why a lot of schools then get to close. But what it actually means, and something perhaps we should be concerned about, is that it probably means that many of our children, are going to spend the rest of their lives poor and unemployed. Sure. Unmute yourself.
Hello?
Okay, yes, I can hear you now.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
I'm saying it is true because as it has been said that education is key. Without education, really forget about your future. And hence we are fighting so hard so that each and every child in South Africa must access education. And not only just access education, but access quality education so that they must be able to create employment for themselves because they acquire skills, they acquire knowledge, they acquire attitude and values at schools, and they will use them in their adult time to create employment through the skills that they acquire from school, the knowledge that they acquire from school, and hence we are saying education is the key. Nothing else. Education. And hence we are fighting so badly with the Department of Education. Said, yes, apparently we have come to a level of universal access, but we are still lacking in terms of quality education for all, particularly the poorest of the poor, the rural, the deep rural, the working class, the township. If we get there, then we know that every person in South Africa at least has something in his or her hand to fend for his or her life through education. Not only education, through quality education.
Special thanks to our guests, Mugwena Maluleke, Matakanye, and Atenkosi Sopiche. Now, up next, we speak to the leader of the official opposition, John Steenhuisen, about a letter he wrote today to President Cyril Ramaphosa requesting an urgent meeting between the head of state and all opposition leaders. Mr. Steenhuisen, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. How did this idea come about, and why do you think it's both urgent and important?
Well, I think it's a follow-up from the meeting that we originally had with the President in the midst of the violence in KwaZulu-Natal almost a fortnight ago. And I certainly made it very clear to the President then that that wasn't the time for accountability, but that we needed to have solutions on the table to get through the problem and that we can deal with the accountability later. I do believe the time has now come for the accountability. The imminent threat has passed and the situation has stabilized. And I think it is right that the opposition who were called to that original meeting are given a briefing about the state of play in terms of the security cluster. We've got conflicting reports between the State Security Minister, Anded Lodlo, and the Police Minister, Bheki Cele, about who knew what, when they knew it, and what they did or didn't do about it. And I think it's only correct that the opposition, as leaders of parties in the country and who have a role to play in settling down some of the churn and unrest, are brought up to speed with exactly where the problem arose, how we ended up in that situation, and settle once and for all whether it was the security services in terms of the intelligence operations or whether it was the operationalization of the SAPS where the problems lay and allowed the looting to continue for a few days unchecked.
What do you think is happening as an outsider looking in? What do you think went on here?
Well, not so much an outsider. Having been on the ground during the course of the violence, I very much have an inside perspective about what was happening. My information is that there were intelligence reports provided. There was an orange notice that was issued by the State Security Department that was forwarded to the national joints, the NAT joints, which is responsible for receiving intelligence and then operationalizing it. It's chaired by the Commissioner of Police and the military, and it's their job to then operationalize it. I'm also told that there were reports made by the State Security Agency on a daily basis leading up to and during the crisis, but that these were not acted upon. So I think that getting to the bottom of these is going to be essential for us to be able to hold people accountable. We've lost over 300 lives and billions of rands worth of damage, and South Africa's international reputation has been severely dented. I don't think that you can just allow people to walk away without some form of accountability and also part of a process to make sure it never happens again.
You don't think that on the question of holding ministers to account, that should be President Cyril Ramaphosa's issue to deal with, and perhaps come back and report to the nation? It's his executive, after all, or as Tito Mboweni put it the other day, he is the conductor of the orchestra that is the cabinet.
Yes, and when the orchestra goes wrong and doesn't play the right music or doesn't pitch up for work, it's Parliament's job to hold it accountable. That's how the Constitution sets it very, very clearly out there, that it is Parliament and opposition parties that are responsible for holding the president accountable. I don't think it's good enough that the opposition leaders are just called in, to tick a box if necessary. I think that there is a duty on the president to take us into his confidence. I'm not asking him to fire or hire anybody in that meeting. I want the state security minister and the police minister in the same meeting with all of us so we can find out exactly who knew what, when they knew it, and what they did or didn't do about it. What the president does with that information afterwards is really his own business. I mean, if he wants to keep a rotten security cluster that's let him down and cost the country so badly, well, that's going to be on his head. But I think as the opposition in Parliament, we've got a right to be able to ask those questions. And I think the president has a duty to answer them and to facilitate his executive getting to the bottom and to the truth of where things went wrong in this terrible crisis.
Which then brings me to the next question, which is it not then the responsibility of those parliamentary committees to do exactly that, to get into the bottom of what actually happened, whether it's the portfolio committee on policing, whether it's the intelligence committee that seemingly hardly functions, or whether it's defense, isn't it the role of those committees, with everything they know and with the powers that the Constitution gives them, to actually get into the detail of all these things?
I think you've partially answered your own question, Vuyo. I don't think those committees function well at all. And we wouldn't be sitting in this mess with an under-resourced, understaffed, an ill-prepared police service without a decent crime intelligence operation and without even the most basic of logistics. We wouldn't be sitting with questions around the intelligence operations. Were those committees doing their work? They haven't. There is no one committee where I believe that all of those agencies, the military, intelligence and the police, can come in together, unless you're going to form an ad hoc committee. But I do think that there was a meeting a fortnight ago with the president and opposition party leaders. That meeting focused on the particular solutions that we believe needed to be implemented immediately. I now think the time for accountability is there, and I don't think that it is odd or unusual for the opposition to be able to ask the president to ask those two ministers to take the opposition leaders through who was ultimately responsible, so we can get to the bottom. So when it comes to Parliament, we know who to call and we know the questions to ask, because it will become very, very clear from that particular meeting whether it was a failure of state security or whether it was a failure of crime intelligence and the SAPS. And I think it'll be able to then allow us to focus that on the particular committee where the problem arose, that we can hold the people accountable, but then also look at solutions to make sure we don't end up in this situation again.
The president, journalists asked the president yesterday whether and when he was going to finally, reshuffle his cabinet. And he said, watch this space, which then suggested that it's something he is about to do. Say he does. Who do you think should go?
Well, I hope it's not the same space he's asked us to watch, that he asked us to watch on Eskom, on SAA and all those other places, because that space is not filled with a very happy space at the moment. Look, it's the president's prerogative about who he chooses and who he does not choose. I think he's been badly let down by his security cluster. I don't think that he had all the information that he required at his fingertips to be able to make some of those decisions. I don't think he was properly appraised about what was happening on the ground. So I think that there's some room for movement in the security cluster. And I definitely think that it's time that he pulls the guillotine down now on Minister Mkhize. We're in the midst of a health pandemic. We've got an acting health minister. I think that there's parts of the SIU report are starting to leak out every single day. And I think that's damaging for the president because he's sitting on that report. And I don't think it takes more than 2 weeks to go through a SIU report that seems to have made, to my readings of the tribunal, that very damning findings against the minister. Why is there this vacillation? The country needs a full-time health minister. We've got a health minister who's been on special leave. And I don't think it's serving the president or the country well. So it's not for me to say who he must choose for his cabinet, but I think that those are some areas where he's going to have to look very, very carefully at bringing in some capacity because he's being let down in that regard.
We actually run out of time, but I have to ask you this. What if the president wants to say, hey, John Steenhuisen, let's all dirty our hands. Don't you want to come on board? I'll give you a portfolio to run. What would you say?
Well, obviously, we'll have to consider it and to see what the terms were. I mean, I've said very, very often that, we want to be part of the solution in South Africa and that we're the president's partners in the rational centre around, fixing South Africa. I think that there's many instances where we agree with what the president's trying to do, the fact that he's being held back by people in his own party, but we'd have to look at what the terms are of that. If it meant that we, would have to give up, independence, etc., we would have to examine that. But my party and I stand very, very ready to get our hands dirty and to offer our expertise and experience in helping to rebuild South Africa. We're in a really bad space at the moment. We've got a hydra of crises, of financial, health, economic, social crises, and I think it's time for the country to come together to find solutions for these things, which makes me very cross that Parliament is closed still and hasn't been recalled. This is a time when the best heads in South Africa should be around the table, not in the sand, and I think that we should be discussing these things.
Thank you very much, John Steenhuisen, for your time. He is, of course, the leader of the official opposition, the Democratic Alliance. Today, he wrote a letter to the president asking him to meet urgently with opposition leaders. And that's where we're going to leave it this evening. Do join us again on Monday. From me and the rest of the team, have a good evening and a great weekend.